Now for those of you looking to add a little bit more utility to your new Yamaha FZ-10, Vagabond Motorsports is releasing a cargo rack kit that is both very easy to install and provides a whole bunch of different mounting options for all your gear. In this video we're just going to do a quick overview of the key details of the kit as well as a quick run through of the installation procedure itself. Now before we go through the really quick process of installing the cargo rack onto the motorcycle, I want to go over some of the key details of the Vagabond Motorsports Cargo Rack for the FZ-10. So it's a steel unit made from CNC laser cut and CNC formed 1/8 inch thick plate. It's twin plated, so galvanized and then powder coated with a UV resistant satin black powder coat, so it should be a very durable and corrosion resistant finish. It's got kind of stepped flanges to follow the contour of the tail section of the bike. It's got oval slots in the front part to add in more areas to kind of hook in and tie down things. The main rectangular surface of the plate is about a 9x8 surface. It's got hooks or holes in the flanges to hook in bungee cords, tie downs, that kind of thing, as well as 6 M6 PEM inserts, so threaded inserts into the top plate that allows you to either use our clamp plate to bolt things down. It'll also pick up a pattern on GV's case mounts and allow a lot more flexibility than a lot of the other cargo racks out there. It's heavy. It's about a 3.1 pound rack. So all in with hardware, you're adding less than 3.5 pounds to the tail section of the bike. So with our fender eliminator, it's kind of a wash at that point. We include a full set of new hardware, including high-strength zinc-plated steel bolts and 2 aluminum spacers that you're going to use at 2 of the rear bolts to tighten up the installation. Now as for tools you're going to need to install the cargo rack, it's a very simple set. 6mm Allen key to remove the stock bolts, 12mm hex socket and ratchet to install the new hardware, and if you've got it, a torque wrench on the order of kind of 23 foot-pounds, 30 Newton meters to set the final torque on the bolts, which is just a good practice because they're load bearing. If you don't have a torque wrench, I wouldn't really sweat it and just tighten them by hand. Alright, so the installation is super easy. You start with the 6mm Allen key. If you've got a T-handle, the torque on these factory bolts should be more than enough to break loose with the T-handle, and go about removing the 4 6mm Allen key bolts on the back side of the motorcycle. Now these bolts are not going to be reused, so set them aside. If you want to swap back and forth between rack and no rack, obviously keep these bolts because the rack bolts are going to be too long to just put back in. The only other thing to notice is the behind each bolt there's a little steel shoulder bushing or washer, and those we're keeping, and that's important to kind of maintain the load transfer between the rack, not crush the plastic, and actually connect it to the subframe. So they may pop out like they did on this side, in which case make sure they go back in. Now for the installation of the rack, you bring your hardware kit over, and there's going to be 2 shorter bolts and 2 longer bolts, and the 2 shorter bolts are going to go in the front flanges and the 2 longer bolts are going to go in the rear flanges with the 1/2 inch aluminum spacers in between the rack and the subframe. So it's not there's any number of ways to go about this installation process. I would recommend starting with the rears just because they're the ones with the spacers, so as you have a little bit more leeway, they are easier to install. I'm going to put the 2 shorter bolts down, grab my second long bolt. There should be enough of a gap to kind of snugly slide, and that was one of those, that was the front shoulder spacer on the other side, and that's okay, but we'll grab that really quick. So I've got the rear bolts actually, excuse me, in at least a couple threads, and you can kind of, while it's still unbolted, you can kind of lift up that front flange and pop in those little shoulder washers. And that's, you mentioned fairly important part. You may have to lift the tail section of the rack a bit just to get all the threads of the bolts aligned. Start getting a couple threads in. So don't go tightening anything just yet. Same kind of thing, pull the front flange out so that you can get the bolts in and put a few threads on it. Now, the way that the rack is set up is the 2 rear bolts are round holes and the 2 front are slots, and that'll give you just a tiny bit of adjustment and accommodate any kind of tolerances and the kind of as-built for the motorcycle. But once you've got them all the bolts, at least a thread or 2 engaged, you can go tighten them all up. I'm just run them in by hand at first, and then we'll put the ratchet to it. So one of the things you'll notice is there is a little bit of give here, and that's to both accommodate manufacturing tolerances on the rack, and what I mean by that is just kind of up and down. And there's enough angle in the as-built that you're probably best to bias it down. And when I say bias it down, it's just pretend like there's a weight on the rack, and that's going to kind of push all the gaps to one direction, and that is going to prevent that happening the first time you use the rack and go over a big bump or anything like that. So if you kind of start in the lower position, because we've got the torque wrench here, we'll just go hand tight with the regular ratchet, and then we'll move to the torque wrench. So from this view you can see a little bit better. This is the location for the aluminum spacer in between the kind of rear set of bolts and the body of the motorcycle. There's no spacers aside from the factory spacers in between the front flanges of the cargo rack. So at this point, got everything hand tight, and really the last step is going to be go to set the torque. And so you can either go relatively tight by hand, or you can grab a torque wrench. We recommend 23 foot-pounds on these. These are M8 bolts, so they're pretty burly, but there's no exact science here to the 23. Beyond that's kind of this recommendation for a class 10.9 bolt of this size. That's what we would recommend if you've got a torque wrench. And at this point, the rack is fully installed. So Vagabond Motorsports sells kind of clamp plate kits that we use on a lot of our racks to clamp down milk crates, your own kind of rear rack system, and you can always use these M6 bolts to put all sorts of stuff on your cargo rack, and that's what a lot of people do in terms of kind of custom tie-down solutions. One of the other things that this pattern of bolts will specifically do is align with GV's set of, I think, monolock rear trunks, so you can get any number of kind of universal monolocks, and they will pick up this pattern. And from this view you should be able to see there's only a couple orientations where this works, but it's using the front 2 of these kind of triangle or diamond shaped holes, and then this pair almost at the back, and that's going to pick up those holes and those holes. I think that's right, yes. But there's any number of other kind of options you can use, and you can always just use this as a normal cargo rack to strap things down. And that's it. The installation for the rack is pretty straightforward. This video is more or less to give potential buyers an idea of kind of like what it looks like, what the options are, just how simple the installation is. You can see it blends in really well from both a kind of color and factory finish standpoint. It looks really good with the Vagabond Motorsports fender eliminator for the FZ-10. And even though it's a pretty big load surface, it actually works quite well with the lines of the motorcycle. You can see there's lots of areas for tie downs kind of along the side of the rack as well as way up front in those oval cutouts. There's actually enough. Those are proud of the surface, so there's enough space to hook in bungee cords and all sorts of things. So with that, I want to say thank you guys for watching this quick little video. You can get the cargo rack direct on our website, www.vagabondmotorsports.com, as well as Amazon for your Prime members and eBay. Thank you very much.